The air in the Ozark Hollow was thick enough to chew. It was a suffocating blanket woven from humidity, the scent of pine rot, and something else, something foul and metallic, like a butcher's shop left to fester in the autumn sun. Deputy Martin Miller felt the bile rise in his throat, a bitter protest against the horrors his eyes were struggling to process. It was late October, 1853. The trees should have been a riot of crimson and gold. The cornfields of the surrounding farms should have stood as brittle, golden skeletons, their harvest long since gathered. But this was the Holloway place, and on the Holloway farm nothing was as it should be. Before him, where rows of corn were meant to be, lay a field of something else. It wasn't a crop. It was a carpet of pale, doughy tissue stretching from the edge of the woods to the dilapidated porch of the farmhouse. The surface was a grotesque tapestry of vein-like structures, pulsing with a slow, hypnotic rhythm, like a single, massive lung taking a shallow breath. The color was the unnerving white of a grub, shot through with angry, violet capillaries, and the smell, that horrifying, sweet, sickly odor of iron and decay, was emanating from this living field. Miller, a man who had seen the grim aftermath of skirmishes and cholera outbreaks, found his hand trembling as it rested on the grip of his Colt. He had come here investigating whispers, stories of disappearances that the townsfolk had tried to laugh off. But there was no laughter here. There was only the low, wet, throbbing sound of the ground itself, and the macabre, unbelievable sight of a farm that had grown flesh instead of corn. Just a year earlier, this very patch of land had been the subject of prayer, not profanity. In the spring of 1852, the Holloway family had arrived, their wagon groaning under the weight of their meager possessions and their boundless, desperate hope. Elias Holloway was a stern, raw-boned man, his face a roadmap of hardship, but his eyes still held a glint of the fire that had driven him west. His wife, Sarah, was quieter, a woman whose resilience was etched in the lines around her mouth, her hands already calloused from a life of toil. With them were their two children, 10-year-old Caleb and 7-year-old Mary, their youthful optimism, a stark contrast to the grim determination of their parents. They had bought the plot sight unseen, a tract of supposedly fertile land tucked deep within the winding, ancient hills of the Ozark Mountains. It was their gamble, their final stand against the poverty that had chased them from the east. This land was meant to be their sanctuary, a place to sink roots deep into the American dream. Standing on the rise overlooking their new home, Elias had wrapped an arm around Sarah, pointing to the sprawling field below. "Here," he had declared, his voice rough with emotion, "we will build a life. This soil will provide. It will answer our prayers." But the Ozarks were an old and secretive place. Its soil held memories and appetites that settlers like the Holloways could never comprehend. Their prayers would be answered, but not by any god they knew. The ground beneath their feet was listening, and it harbored a curse of its own. The Ozark Mountains in the mid-19th century were a world unto themselves, a labyrinth of limestone bluffs, shadowed hollows, and dense, primordial forests. For the settlers, it was a land of brutal contradictions. It offered life in the form of abundant game and timber, but it also promised death through isolation, harsh winters, and the ever-present threat of disease. The Holloway farm was particularly remote, nestled in a deep valley accessible only by a winding, treacherous cart path that was often washed out by rain. Their nearest neighbor was a hard day's ride away. This profound isolation was a double-edged sword. It offered freedom from the judging eyes of society, but it also meant that no help was coming. A scream could echo for miles and be answered only by the rustle of leaves. The local folklore, a tapestry woven from the superstitions of Scots-Irish settlers and the far older legends of the Osage and Cherokee tribes who had once walked these hills, was thick with warnings. They spoke of places where the veil between worlds was thin, of creatures that mimicked human voices to lure travelers from the path, and of soil that remembered bloodshed. There were stories of a hungry earth, a malicious sentience within the land itself that resented the plow and the axe. These were tales told around flickering fires, dismissed in the harsh light of day as fanciful nonsense. But in the suffocating silence of a place like the Holloway Hollow, where the woods pressed in on all sides and the stars seemed impossibly distant, such stories felt disturbingly real. The land was not empty. It was watchful. It was waiting. The first season was a testament to the land's brutal indifference. The Holloways toiled from sunup to sundown, their bodies aching, their hands bleeding. Elias broke the stubborn, rocky soil with a single ox, his face a mask of grim resolve. Sarah and the children planted the corn, their hopes buried with each seed. They prayed for rain, and a merciless sun baked the earth into a cracked, barren shell. They prayed for relief, and a strange, rust-colored blight crept through their meager stalks, shriveling the leaves and leaving the ears of corn stunted and rotten. By autumn, their planned harvest was a catastrophic failure. The cellar, meant to be overflowing with preserved food for the winter, held only a few jars of foraged berries and a handful of withered vegetables. Desperation began to set in, a cold, creeping dread that was more chilling than the mountain wind. The family's isolation, once a symbol of their independence, now felt like a cage. The vibrant chatter of the children faded into listless silence. Sarah grew thin, her eyes large and haunted in her gaunt face. Elias, however, did not succumb to despair. Instead, something harder and stranger took its place. The failure of the crop was not just a financial ruin, it was a personal affront, a challenge from the land itself. He had made a promise to his family, and the earth had defied him. He would not be beaten. He began to spend his days walking the perimeter of his property, his gaze fixed on the dead, blighted field, a disturbing intensity burning in his eyes. As winter's cold grip tightened on the mountains, a different kind of chill settled over the Holloway cabin. Elias changed. The transformation was subtle at first, a slow erosion of the man Sarah had known. He grew silent, his conversations dwindling to curt, one-word answers. He would sit by the fire for hours, not speaking, not moving, just staring into the flames with an unnerving focus. The shared warmth of their marital bed became a cold, empty space between two strangers. Soon, his strange behavior escalated. Sarah would wake in the dead of night to find his side of the bed empty. Peering through the cabin's single, grimy window, she would see his silhouette moving through the dead cornfield under the ghostly light of the moon. He would walk the rows, sometimes stopping to kneel, pressing his hands into the cold, barren earth as if listening for a heartbeat. Muttered to himself, his words lost to the wind, a low, constant drone that sounded less like a prayer and more like an incantation. When Sarah confronted him, his reaction was terrifying. His eyes, once familiar and loving, were now filled with a cold, possessive fury. "This is my land," he hissed, his voice a stranger's. "It will provide. I will make it provide." She saw then that his desperation had curdled into a dark, dangerous obsession. He was no longer trying to work with the land. He was trying to command it, to bend its will to his own. And in the ancient, whispering woods of the Ozarks, such hubris never went unpunished. The discovery that sealed their fate happened during a late winter thaw. Elias, driven by a restless energy, had been exploring the deepest, most inaccessible parts of his property, a tangled section of old-growth forest that the sun rarely touched. It was there, hidden beneath a gnarled, moss-covered rock outcropping, that he found it, a hidden spring. But the water that bubbled up from the earth was not clear. It was thick, viscous, and the color of rust, leaving a dark red stain on the stones it touched. It had a faint, coppery smell. An animal that had died nearby, perhaps. But the spring was not the only discovery. Buried in the mud at its edge, his boot struck something hard. He dug frantically with his bare hands, pulling 3 flat, dark stones from the earth. They were not natural formations. Their surfaces were covered in strange, spiraling symbols and geometric patterns unlike any he had ever seen, not the work of settlers, nor the familiar markings of the local tribes. They felt ancient, exuding a palpable cold that seeped into his skin, even through his gloves. He felt a dizzying sense of vertigo, as if he were standing on the edge of a great precipice. He knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that he had stumbled upon something forbidden, a source of power that lay dormant in the heart of his land. He looked from the unsettling stones to the reddish water of the spring, and then back towards his blighted, useless field. A horrifying idea, a blasphemous solution to his family's desperation, began to take root in his mind. Elias told no one of his discovery. The dark stones and the memory of the coppery spring became his secret, a forbidden knowledge that he nurtured in the silent corners of his mind. He waited for the next new moon, an old superstition he'd heard from his grandmother, a belief that what is planted in darkness will yield a powerful, secret harvest. On that moonless, starless night, while his family slept, he slipped out of the cabin. He carried two things: one of the carved stones and a large wooden bucket filled with the thick, reddish water from the hidden spring. He walked to the very center of his dead cornfield. The silence was absolute, the darkness so complete it felt like a physical weight. There, under the oppressive black sky, he performed his ritual. He scraped a shallow basin in the dirt and poured the viscous water into it. The liquid didn't soak into the earth right away. It pooled, shimmering faintly with a greasy, unnatural iridescence. He then took the stone and, using its sharp edge, sliced open the palm of his own hand. He let his blood drip into the basin, watching it swirl and mix with the strange water. As he did, he whispered a desperate, rambling plea to the soil, to the land, to whatever ancient, sleeping thing might be listening. He offered his own lifeblood as a promise, a down payment for a harvest that would save his family. When he was done, he buried the blood-soaked stone in the mud. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then he felt it, a low, deep tremor that seemed to rise from the very bones of the earth, a faint, subterranean vibration that lasted only a second. It was an acknowledgement. A bargain had been struck. Weeks passed. The harsh winter gave way to a wet, anemic spring. Elias watched the field with a hawk's intensity, a mixture of terror and hope warring in his heart. Sarah tried to convince him to plant normal seeds, to try again with potatoes or beans, but he refused, his eyes wild with a feverish certainty. "Just wait," he would command. "The ground is preparing." Then, one morning, it happened. Pushing through the dark, damp soil were not the familiar green shoots of corn. They were pale, almost translucent nubs, the color of bleached bone. They looked disturbingly organic, like the fruiting bodies of some grotesque underground fungus, or perhaps the embryonic digits of something trying to claw its way to the surface. Sarah recoiled in horror, pulling the children away from the field's edge. This was not right. This was an abomination. But Elias was ecstatic. He saw it as a miracle, a sign that his sacrifice had been accepted. He forbade anyone from going near the field, pacing its perimeter like a sentinel guarding a sacred site. The strange growths didn't seek the sun. They seemed to swell from within, drawing nourishment not from the sky, but from the tainted soil below. Every day they grew larger, more defined, their pallid forms looking less and less like any known vegetation, and more like something disturbingly anatomical. The field was coming alive, and its awakening was a monstrous, unnatural birth. The growth was unnervingly rapid. Within a fortnight, the entire field was a sea of the pale, fleshy mounds. They did not grow upward into stalks, but expanded outward, their edges merging until they formed a continuous, undulating carpet of tissue. From a distance, it might have been mistaken for a late-lying patch of snow, but up close, the horror was undeniable. The surface of this crop was disturbingly skin-like, covered in a network of dark, purplish veins that pulsed with a slow, sickening rhythm. The air around the farm grew heavy with a strange, cloying odor, a mixture of damp earth, raw meat, and the sweet, sickly smell of blood. It clung to their clothes, their hair, the very wood of the cabin. It was the smell of a slaughterhouse. The children complained of nightmares. Caleb spoke of a scratching sound from beneath the floorboards, while Mary whimpered in her sleep about a red man who walked in the field and had no face. Elias dismissed their fears, his obsession now absolute. He spent all his time with his horrifying crop, sometimes touching it with a strange reverence, his expression one of rapturous devotion. He was no longer a farmer tending his field. He was a priest tending his altar. To him, this was a miracle, a divine gift born of desperation and blood. To Sarah, it was a waking nightmare, a clear sign that a terrible evil had taken root in their lives, an evil that was now growing just outside their door. The breaking point for Sarah came when she saw a twitch. She was standing at the window, watching the field with a familiar sense of dread, when a section of the pale, fleshy ground spasmed, a violent, involuntary muscle contraction that rippled across the surface. It was undeniably, horribly alive. That evening, her fear finally overriding her obedience, she confronted Elias. She begged him, her voice cracking with terror, to take an axe, a torch, anything, and destroy the abomination in the field. She told him it was a curse, a demonic blight that would consume them all. Elias turned to her, and the man she had married was gone. In his place was a zealot, his eyes glowing with a terrifying, unholy light. "You see a curse. I see salvation," he roared, grabbing her arm in a painful grip. "This is a gift from the soil. It has given us life where there was only death. It is a provider." He dragged her to the door, forcing her to look at the pulsating, grotesque landscape. "You are forbidden from harming it. You are forbidden from speaking of it to anyone. It is ours." The vehemence in his voice, the sheer madness in his eyes, terrified her more than the field itself. She realized he wasn't just protecting it, he was worshipping it. The official records of what happened next have been lost to time, perhaps sealed or destroyed entirely. To uncover these forbidden histories, make sure you subscribe to our channel, because the whispers from the Ozark Hollows are about to grow into a scream. The isolation that had once been a burden now became Elias Holloway's shield. He had something to hide, a horrifying secret that was growing larger and more demanding with each passing day. It was early summer when the first outsider stumbled upon this secret. A traveling peddler named Silas Cobb, a familiar and welcome sight in these remote parts, was making his usual circuit. He was a cheerful man, his wagon filled with pots, pans, needles, and news from the wider world. His route took him right past the turnoff to the Holloway farm. He was last seen by another farmer, miles away, heading in that direction. Silas Cobb never made it to the next settlement. A week later, his lone horse was found wandering aimlessly, its harness tangled, the wagon nowhere in sight. A cursory search was organized, but the Ozark wilderness was vast and unforgiving. It was assumed Silas had met with an accident, perhaps fallen into a ravine or been taken by a panther. No one thought to make the arduous journey to the isolated Holloway farm to ask questions. It was easier to believe in a natural accident than a macabre, unnatural crime. But on the Holloway farm, a few days after Silas vanished, the pulsating field seemed to swell, its pale color taking on a healthier, more vibrant hue. And deep in the woods, hidden under a pile of freshly cut brush, a splintered wagon wheel and a collection of tin pots and pans slowly began to rust. The time for the harvest came as summer reached its peak. The field had stopped expanding and the rhythmic pulsing had slowed. Elias declared it was ready. He sharpened a long, curved scythe, its edge gleaming in the sun. But the sound of this harvest was not the crisp, dry rustle of corn stalks. It was a wet, tearing, sickening sound, like a butcher carving a massive carcass. The blade cut through the fleshy substance with a squelching noise, and a thick, dark red fluid, like sluggish blood, oozed from the wounds. Air, already foul, became thick with the fresh stench of viscera. Sarah locked herself in the cabin with the children, pressing rags against the bottom of the door to keep the smell out, but it was useless. It seeped through the very walls. Elias worked for 2 days, tirelessly carving the field into great, pale slabs. He hauled the grotesque harvest in a wheelbarrow, not to the barn, but to the root cellar beneath the cabin. He made trip after trip, his clothes and skin stained with the dark, viscous fluid. When he was finished, he secured the cellar door with a new, heavy wooden bar. He forbade Sarah from ever opening it. That night, the real terror began for the children. As they lay in their small beds, they could hear noises from below their feet, a soft, wet, rhythmic sliding sound, punctuated by a faint, persistent scratching. It was the sound of something moving in the cellar, something that had been harvested but was not entirely dead. News of Silas, the peddler's disappearance, eventually trickled through the scattered settlements. While most accepted the theory of an accident, a few old-timers harbored darker suspicions. The Ozarks had a way of swallowing people, and not always by accident. One of the men who felt a prickle of unease was Josiah Miller, a grizzled farmer whose land was the closest to the Holloways, though still half a day's ride away. Josiah had traded with Elias once or twice and had found him to be a hard but decent man. He knew the Holloways hadn't been to the trading post in months, which was unusual, even for isolated folk. Spurred by a nagging worry, he saddled his horse and made the difficult journey to their valley. He was met not with hospitality but with outright hostility. Elias Holloway intercepted him at the edge of the property line, his face gaunt, his eyes burning with a paranoid fire. He held a rusty sickle in one hand. When Josiah asked after his family and their crop, Elias gave a curt, dismissive answer. "We're fine. The land is providing," he grunted, blocking the path. But what truly unsettled Josiah was the smell. A putrid carrion wind blew from the direction of the farm, a smell so foul he had to fight the urge to gag. It was a smell of death, but on a scale he couldn't comprehend. He made his excuses and retreated, but the image of Elias' wild eyes and the memory of that horrifying stench haunted him. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that something was terribly wrong in that hollow. Locked in her cabin, a prisoner in her own home, Sarah Holloway's mind began to fracture under the strain. Her only connection to the outside world was her husband, and he had become a monster. Her world had shrunk to the four walls of the cabin, the terrified faces of her children, and the constant, oppressive presence of the cellar below. Driven by a desperate need to understand the horror that had consumed her life, she did the unthinkable. One afternoon, while Elias was in the woods, she took a knife and a lantern and pried open a loose floorboard in the corner of the room, creating a small crack through which she could see into the cellar. What she saw would haunt her for the rest of her days. The cellar was piled high with the pale, fleshy harvest. In the flickering lamplight, she could see that the substance was not inert. It quivered, parts of it contracting and relaxing in a slow, peristaltic rhythm. It was veined with a complex network of dark, sluggish arteries. It was not a plant. It was not a fungus. It was a mass of living, organized tissue, a grotesque organ without a body. As she watched, a section of the mass near the floor began to extrude a thin, translucent tendril which scraped slowly against the stone wall, the source of the scratching her children heard every night. This was not a crop to be eaten. It was a living, growing entity, and her family was sleeping on top of it. As autumn approached, the woods around the Holloway farm became a popular hunting ground. The deer population was plentiful that year, drawing men from settlements even farther afield. Two such men, brothers named Ben and Levi Gable, were tracking a large buck deep into the forest. They were experienced woodsmen, familiar with every trail and landmark for miles around. Their hunt led them to the ridges overlooking the deep hollow where the Holloway farm lay hidden. They were last seen by another hunter at dawn, heading into the dense woods, their rifles on their shoulders. They never returned. When they failed to show up at the designated camp that evening, a search party was formed. They scoured the woods for 2 days. They found the tracks of the buck and the tracks of the two men following it. Both sets of tracks led to the edge of the ridge above the Holloway place, and then they simply stopped. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, no broken branches. It was as if the two men and the deer they were hunting had been plucked from the face of the earth. Back in the nearest settlement, the whispers grew louder and took on a more sinister tone. First a peddler, now 2 hunters, all vanished in the same area. The stories about the Holloway land being cursed, once dismissed as folklore, were now repeated with a new, fearful conviction. The place was being given a wide berth. It was becoming forbidden ground. The malevolent entity in the field was not content with its boundaries. Its influence was beginning to bleed into the surrounding landscape, a creeping biological corruption. The trees at the edge of the woods, the ones closest to the harvested field, began to change. Their bark grew pale and puffy, taking on a soft, unhealthy texture. Their branches twisted into gnarled, unnatural shapes like arthritic fingers. A strange, pale lichen which seemed to weep a reddish, oily substance coated their trunks. The water in the family's drinking well turned brackish and foul, developing the same coppery tang as the forbidden spring deep in the woods. The few remaining chickens on the farm sickened and died, their bodies strangely bloated. Even the insects seemed to flee. The usual drone of cicadas and crickets was replaced by an unnerving silence. The farm was becoming an ecosystem unto itself, a monstrous biome with the flesh field at its heart. It was as if the very soil was being rewritten, its fundamental nature being overwritten by a horrifying alien biology. The Holloway farm was no longer just a place where a monstrous thing grew. The farm itself was becoming part of the monster, an extension of its macabre and hungry will. Elias, in his madness, saw this as a blessing, a sign of the land's power. Sarah saw it for what it was. They weren't living on the curse. They were being digested by it. Sarah Holloway's sanity was a flickering candle in a storm. Trapped with a husband she no longer recognized and a horror she could not name, she sought refuge in the only way she could. She began to write. She had a small, leather-bound journal, a wedding gift from her mother which she had kept hidden away. It now became her confessional, her final testament. Using a small nub of charcoal, she secretly documented the escalating nightmare. She wrote of the pulsating floorboards, the feeling of the house breathing around her at night. She described the whispers she heard on the wind, a sibilant, hungry language that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. S.H. He detailed Elias' complete devotion to the entity, how he would feed the harvested flesh in the cellar with buckets of water from the tainted well, how he would speak to it in low, reverent tones. Her entries grew more frantic, the charcoal scrawls barely legible. "Elias is no longer my husband," she wrote one night, her hand trembling. "His skin is pale. He does not bleed when he cuts himself. He says the hungry soil is making him strong. He says it will make us all strong. He is trying to feed it to the children. I lock them in the room with me when he sleeps. God help us. The ground is hungry and he means to feed it his family." Her journal was no longer just a record of events. It was a desperate message in a bottle, cast into a sea of madness. The frantic pleas of Josiah Miller finally broke through the skepticism of the local law. His son, Deputy Martin Miller, was a young man, pragmatic and dismissive of the backwoods superstitions that his father clung to. He had heard the rumors about the vanished hunters and the peddler, but he attributed them to the known dangers of the wilderness. But the genuine terror in his father's eyes was something he could not ignore. Josiah described the hostile, almost inhuman man Elias Holloway had become, and the god-awful, soul-chilling stench that clung to his valley. "It ain't natural, Martin," the old man had insisted, his voice low and trembling. "It's the smell of a crypt the size of a whole dam farm. Something's wrong out there, something evil." Reluctantly, more to appease his father than out of any real belief in a crime, Deputy Miller agreed to ride out to the Holloway place. He was a man of logic, of evidence. He believed in mundane evil, greed, jealousy, drunken violence. He did not believe in curses or hungry soil. As he saddled his horse that crisp October morning, he expected to find a family struggling with blight and poverty, perhaps a bit of backwoods madness born of isolation. He armed himself with a revolver and a healthy dose of condescending rationality. He was utterly unprepared for the fact that, for once, the old, superstitious stories were not just true, but were a pale, inadequate shadow of the horrifying reality. The journey to the Holloway farm was an unsettling immersion into silence. As Deputy Miller rode deeper into the mountains, the familiar sounds of the forest began to die away. The chattering of squirrels ceased. The birdsong fell silent. Even the rustle of unseen creatures in the underbrush seemed to be muted, replaced by a heavy, expectant stillness. The air grew cold, carrying the first hints of that foul, metallic odor his father had described. It was faint at first, a barely perceptible stain on the clean autumn air, but it grew stronger with every mile, a promise of the corruption that lay ahead. His horse became skittish, its ears twitching, its eyes wide with animal fear. It fought the reins, trying to turn back, and Miller had to fight to keep the animal moving forward. He passed the twisted, pale-barked trees that marked the edge of the Holloway property, their grotesque forms like silent, skeletal warnings. The sense of being watched was overwhelming. It wasn't the feeling of a predator in the woods. It was the feeling of the woods themselves, the very earth and trees, observing his intrusion with a cold, ancient malice. By the time the dilapidated Holloway cabin came into view, The deputy's confident skepticism had evaporated, replaced by a primal, chilling dread. Logic had no place here. This was a place of deep wrongness, a wound on the face of the world. The farmhouse stood silent and derelict, a dark silhouette against the pulsating, pale field. No smoke rose from the chimney. No chickens pecked in the yard. The only movement was the slow, rhythmic heaving of the ground. Deputy Miller dismounted, drawing his Colt, the click of the hammer unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. He called out, "Holloway, this is the law." For a long moment there was no answer. Then the cabin door creaked open and Elias Holloway emerged. He was a horrifying caricature of the man Josiah Miller had described. His skin had a waxy, pallid sheen like the flesh in the field. His clothes were tattered and stained, but it was his eyes that stopped Miller cold. They were utterly devoid of reason, glowing with the flat, black intensity of a predator. He held a wood axe loosely in one hand. "You're trespassing," Elias rasped, his voice a dry, dead whisper. "Leave." Miller stood his ground, gesturing with his pistol toward the field. "What in God's name is that? Where is your family, Elias?" A slow, unnerving smile spread across Holloway's face. "The family is fine," he whispered. "The land provides for us all. It has provided for Silas Cobb. It has provided for the Gable brothers. Now it will provide for you." The direct confession, delivered with such calm, chilling madness, sent a spike of pure ice through the deputy's vein. Ignoring Holloway's menacing presence, Miller kept his pistol leveled and slowly backed towards the barn, his eyes scanning for any sign of Sarah and the children. The barn door hung ajar on a single rusty hinge. The stench of decay was even stronger here, mixed with the acrid smell of lye. Pushing the door open, Miller was met with a macabre scene. The interior was not filled with hay and farm tools. It was a makeshift charnel house. Hanging from the rafters were the skeletal remains of several deer and other large animals, their bones picked clean with an unnatural precision, as if they had been boiled. In the corner was a pile of discarded clothing, a peddler's woolen coat, a pair of hunting boots, a child's worn-out bonnet that had no business being there. And on the far wall, the true horror was revealed. Painted in a dark, flaking substance that could only be dried blood were the same spiraling geometric symbols Elias had found on the ancient stones. They covered the wall, a vast and complex mural of madness. Miller realized this was not just a farm. It was a temple, a place of ritual and sacrifice. Elias was not just a farmer. He was the high priest of some ancient, bloodthirsty god that slept beneath the soil. The evidence of the missing men was all around him, a silent testament to the farm's horrifying appetite. Miller's foot kicked something as he backed out of the barn. It was a half-buried wooden crate. He used the barrel of his gun to pry the lid open. Inside was a jumble of personal effects, a grim collection of trophies taken from the farm's victims. There was Silas Cobb's recognizable tin cup, a silver-inlaid hunting knife that belonged to Levi Gable, a small, carved wooden bird that must have belonged to a child, and a tarnished silver locket. He opened the locket. Inside was a tiny, faded portrait of a young woman he didn't recognize. The truth crashed down on him with the force of a physical blow. The disappearances weren't random. This was a feeding ground. Elias was luring people to this isolated place, or perhaps simply preying on those who wandered too close. They weren't just killed. They were used. They were the fertilizer. They were the obscene nourishment for the living, breathing field of flesh. The blight, the desperation, the discovery in the woods, it had all led to this. Elias had made a pact with the hungry earth, and he was paying his dues in human lives. The scale of the depravity was staggering. This wasn't just murder. It was a form of macabre agriculture, a harvest of souls to feed a thing that should not exist. As the horrifying realization settled in, Miller heard a faint sound from the house, a muffled sob quickly silenced. Sarah and the children, they were still here. He turned, his gun trained on Elias, who was watching him with that same detached, reptilian smile. "Where are they, Elias?" Miller demanded, his voice shaking with rage. Elias just gestured vaguely toward the house. Seizing a moment of distraction, Miller lunged for the cabin door, shoving it open and rushing inside. The interior was dark and rank with the smell of fear and filth. A heavy bar was secured across the cellar door. From behind it he could hear a frantic scratching. He put his shoulder to the door once, twice, and on the third try the wood splintered. As the door swung open, the sight that greeted him was one of pure Gothic horror. Huddled in the corner of the dark, damp cellar, away from the pulsating piles of harvested flesh, were Sarah Holloway and her 2 children. They were skeletal, their skin a translucent white from lack of sunlight, their eyes wide and terrified like cornered animals. They were prisoners, locked away in the larder with the monster's food, their husband and father their jailer. Sarah looked at Miller, not with relief, but with a stark, animal terror that encompassed the entire, horrifying situation. "You have to get out," Sarah shrieked, her voice a raw, broken thing. She scrambled up from the corner, shoving a small, charcoal-stained book into Miller's hands, her journal. "It's the ground, the hungry soil," she screamed, her words tumbling over one another in a frantic torrent of madness and terror. "He doesn't control it, it controls him. He feeds the ground." Her children cowered behind her, their small faces streaked with tears and grime. She grabbed Miller's arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "He feeds it, and when there's no one else, he'll feed it us." At that moment, a shadow fell across the doorway. Elias stood there, the axe now held firmly in his hands. The smile was gone, replaced by a mask of cold, absolute rage. He wasn't looking at Miller, he was looking at Sarah, a look of profound betrayal in his dead eyes. "You would ruin the harvest," he whispered, his voice dangerously calm. "It gave us everything. It made us strong." Outside, as if responding to the rising tension, a low, deep groaning sound began to emanate from the field. The rhythmic poo. Elsing quickened, the ground beginning to churn as if a great beast were stirring from its slumber. The field was awake, and it was angry. What happened next was not a fight between 2 men. It was a confrontation between a man and a monster wearing a man's skin. Elias Holloway moved with an unnatural speed and strength, the axe whistling through the air. Miller fired his Colt, the shot echoing like a thunderclap inside the small cabin. The bullet struck Elias in the shoulder, staggering him, but he didn't cry out. He barely seemed to notice. A dark, thick fluid, the same color as the ooze from the field, seeped from the wound, but he kept coming, his eyes locked on Miller with murderous intent. This was a battle for survival, fought in a house that was already half digested by a subterranean horror. The very foundations of what is known about our history are sometimes built on lies, to cover up truths too disturbing to face. If you find a thrill in digging up these banned and forbidden stories, help our channel grow by hitting the like button and subscribing, because the climax of the Holloway curse is a testament to why some truths should stay buried forever. Elias was no longer just a man protecting his farm. He was an antibody, an extension of the field's will, trying to eliminate a threat. He was a part of the organism, and it was now defending itself through him. The fight inside the cabin was a desperate, brutal affair. Miller dodged another swing of the axe, the blade embedding itself in the doorframe. He brought the butt of his pistol down on Elias' head, but the man just shook it off, a low growl rumbling in his chest. It was then that the house itself began to protest. The floorboards groaned and buckled. A great tremor shook the cabin to its foundations. Outside, the groaning from the field escalated into a deafening, wet, tearing roar. Through the open doorway, Miller could see a horrifying spectacle. The entire field was in motion. The pale, fleshy ground was erupting, splitting open as thick, muscular tendrils, like the tentacles of some colossal squid, burst forth from the soil. They whipped through the air, smashing against the side of the barn, splintering the wood as if it were kindling. The ground was not just alive. It was mobile, aggressive, and sentient. It was a predator, and its territory had been invaded. The fight for survival was no longer just against Elias Holloway. It was against the entire farm. The hungry soil had been awakened, and it was demanding a sacrifice. In the midst of the chaos, as the house began to tear itself apart, Elias suddenly stopped fighting. He turned his head, a look of rapturous awe on his face, as if listening to a call only he could hear. He dropped the axe and stumbled out of the cabin, his arms outstretched towards the writhing, chaotic field. A massive, pale tendril thicker than a tree trunk rose from the ground and coiled around his body. Miller, watching from the shattered doorway, expected to hear screams of agony. But Elias didn't scream, he laughed. It was a sound of pure, ecstatic release. He looked back at his terrified family one last time, a look of blissful peace on his face before the tendril constricted, pulling him off his feet. He was dragged into the roiling, churning heart of the fleshy field. The ground opened up like a wound, a gaping maw in the earth, and swallowed him whole. He did not fight. He did not struggle. He merged with the entity he had worshipped, becoming one with his God, his body a final, willing sacrament to the hungry soil. He was not consumed. He was welcomed home. The horrifying spectacle of Elias' assimilation shocked Miller back into action. The tendrils were now lashing at the cabin itself, tearing at the roof and walls, trying to pull the structure down into the churning earth. He grabbed Sarah and the children, shoving them out the back window, away from the main field. "Run!" he screamed, his voice hoarse. "Run and don't look back." They scrambled into the woods, Sarah half carrying, half dragging the weeping Mary, while Caleb ran blindly ahead. Miller followed, firing his last few shots at the grasping appendages, the bullets sinking into the pale flesh with wet thuds but having little effect. He risked one last glance over his shoulder. The entire Holloway farm was being devoured. The house, the barn, the fences, everything was being dragged down into the writhing, pulsating pit of flesh. The ground convulsed in a final, massive spasm, and then with a great, sucking sigh, it was over. The tendrils retracted, the churning ceased, and the land fell silent. They ran, fueled by pure adrenaline and terror, not stopping until the sounds and smells of the Holloway Hollow were far behind them, a fading nightmare at their backs. 2 days later, Deputy Miller returned, leading a posse of 20 armed and deeply skeptical men. He had tried to explain what he had seen. His frantic, disjointed story met with looks of pity and disbelief. They thought the horror of finding the missing men's belongings had broken his mind. He led them back down the treacherous path, steeling himself for the horror he would have to reveal. But when they arrived at the hollow, there was nothing to see. The farm was gone. Where the cabin, the barn, and the pulsating field of flesh had been, there was now only a wide, barren clearing of exposed rock and gravel, scoured clean as if by a great flood. The house was a pile of splintered, collapsed timbers in the center, looking like a ruin that had been abandoned for 50 years, not 2 days. There was no sign of the grotesque crop, no trace of the tendrils, no lingering smell of rot and blood. It was as if the earth had simply erased the entire, horrifying chapter. The posse looked at Miller, then at the barren ground, and their skepticism hardened into accusation. There was no body, no monster, no evidence of a crime beyond the pile of rotting timbers. The land itself had hidden the evidence, digesting the horror and leaving behind a cold, clean slate. The official inquiry was a brief and embarrassing affair for Deputy Martin Miller. His testimony, filled with talk of a living field and hungry soil, was officially recorded as the product of trauma and delusion. The posse members confirmed only that the farm was destroyed and the family was gone. Lacking any other explanation, the official record was sealed with a mundane lie. Elias Holloway, it was decided, was a madman who had likely murdered the peddler and the hunters. In a fit of guilt or further madness, he had burned his own farm down, and in the ensuing blaze, he and his family had either perished or fled into the wilderness, never to be seen again. The case was closed. Sarah and her children, who were found wandering in a state of deep shock miles away, were quietly sent to live with distant relatives in another state. Their testimony, which corroborated Miller's, was suppressed, dismissed as the fanciful stories of terrified, traumatized children and their hysterical mother. The horrifying truth of the Holloway farm was officially banned, buried under the weight of bureaucratic denial. It was easier to believe in a lone madman than to accept that the very ground beneath their feet could be a sentient, malevolent predator. Deputy Miller kept Sarah Holloway's journal. He read it over and over, the charcoal-smudged pages becoming a testament to a truth only he and the survivors knew. The final entry, written just a day before he arrived, was the one that haunted his dreams for the rest of his life. "The harvest is in the cellar," Sarah had written. "But the rot is not just in the field. Elias has been using water from the deep spring for everything, to wash, to drink. He boils the roots from the garden in it for our supper. He says it is a blessing from the soil. I see the change in the children, the pallor of their skin, the vacant look in their eyes. Caleb does not cry anymore. I fear the hungry soil is not just outside. I fear he has planted its seed inside of us. It is in our blood now, in our bones, a dormant curse waiting for the right ground to take root again. We did not escape. We are merely carrying the blight to a new field." The journal ended there. A cold case on the books, but a terrifying, living legacy carried in the veins of its survivors. The Holloway farm was never resettled. The land was declared unstable and unsafe, a convenient fiction to keep people away. But the story did not die. It transformed, as all horrifying truths do, into folklore. It became a local ghost story, a creepy legend whispered by parents to keep their children from wandering too deep into the woods. They called it the Holloway Blight, or Hungry Hollow. They said the ghost of Elias Holloway still walked the barren patch of land, seeking victims to feed the eternally starving ground. The place itself took on a sinister reputation. Locals claimed that no birds sang near the clearing, that animals instinctively avoided it, and that on still nights you could hear a faint, rhythmic pulsing sound rising from the bare rock. The legend became a permanent, macabre fixture of the Ozark Mountains, a warning embedded in the local culture. The ground was cursed, they said. It was banned. It was a place to be forgotten, a place where a dark and terrible hunger still slept, waiting. Centuries pass, but the earth remembers. The story of the Holloway farm has faded into the obscurity of macabre, unbelievable folklore. But strange echoes of the tale persist into the modern era. Geologists mapping the region have noted inexplicable magnetic anomalies and strange, periodic seismic vibrations originating from that specific, uncharted hollow. Soil samples taken from the perimeter of the barren clearing show a complete lack of microbial life, a sterile, dead zone where nothing can grow. Hikers and hunters who have strayed from the marked trails into that are. I have reported a pervasive sense of dread, a feeling of being watched by an unseen, malevolent intelligence. More disturbing are the modern cold cases. Over the decades, a statistically significant number of people have vanished without a trace from the national forest land that now encompasses the old Holloway property. Their cars are found abandoned on lonely service roads, their trails going cold at the edge of the deep woods. It's a place the park rangers quietly refer to as a Bermuda Triangle of the Ozarks. These are dismissed as unfortunate accidents, but for those who know the forbidden legend, they are a chilling sign that the entity is not dead. It is merely dormant. It is merely sleeping. The disturbing, macabre legend of the Holloway farm stands as a stark and terrifying warning. It is a testament to the primal horrors that can be born from human desperation when it collides with forces far older and more powerful than we can possibly comprehend. We build our homes, plow our fields, and draw our maps, imposing our will upon the land, believing we have tamed it. But we are merely tenants on a planet whose deepest secrets remain buried and unknown. The story suggests that the Earth is not a passive stage for our lives, but a silent, watchful entity with an ancient and unknowable consciousness. What Elias Holloway awakened with his blood and his despair was not a demon or a spirit, but the land itself, in its most raw, predatory, and hungry form. It leaves us with a final, chilling question that lingers long after the story is told. How many other hollows, how many other deep, forgotten places in the world hold a similar, sleeping power? What other ancient, ravenous things lie dormant just beneath our feet, listening to our desperate prayers and waiting for a single drop of blood to awaken them?